thank you for coming out tonight. Welcome to Southern Methodist University, and for this evening at least, the Center for Presidential History. My name is Jeffrey Engel, and I have the high honor of directing that center and also of being your host for this evening. So welcome to our first lecture of the year in this, our Presidential History and Memoir series, which is of course developed as a vibrant partnership between ourselves and the George W. Bush Library. So to Alan Lowe, Director of the Library, and his staff here tonight, who are our collaborators, but also our colleagues here on the Hilltop, welcome again. Now, 1 year ago, it occurred to me as I was preparing for tonight, 1 year ago, our center was literally walls and carpeting and a paper sign on the door, which I wrote so nobody could read it. And Alan's folks were gearing up for a big event for that spring, of course, the opening of their impressive facility. And it occurs to me that there's a tremendous difference that a year makes, not least of which because I think our collective blood pressures are lower this year than last. So to our friends also at the Bush Foundation Institute, thank you for coming. And indeed, as I look out over this crowd, I'm so pleased to see so many new friends and supporters of our center and also of our beloved SMU. So let me indeed thank you for your attendance this evening and also for all you do for us throughout the entire year. Let me welcome in particular those members of SMU's Board of Trustees who are here tonight, including Mr. Bobby Lyle and Dottie Brodsky, who, if I'm not mistaken, was the first person to enter their name on our email list and therefore forevermore has the lifetime designation of CPH fan #1. So welcome. Now we have a tremendous lineup of events for you this year and in the upcoming months, including, I want to highlight next month, an event that was put together by our Associate Director, Dr. Brian Franklin, where we're going to be gathering on one stage for the first time ever all the past and current directors of the White House Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. This is the first time they'll ever appear on the same stage together, and so therefore it should be not only an exciting evening, but also an unprecedented one indeed. So please do check out our webpage as well as our Facebook page for more details, and also for details on our collective memory project of the George W. Bush administration and years, and also the scholarly and community engagement which our center aims to foster. Let me turn then now to the reason for your coming out tonight, which is of course to hear from Dr. Catherine Allgor. Now she needs very little introduction, but I'll give her one anyway, for you know from reading her bio of her impressive list of accomplishments. She's a noted writer and historian with 4 major books to her name. She's a distinguished teacher as a professor of history at the University of California, Riverside, and also holds a very prestigious presidential chair at that system. Hers is also a very frequent voice that one hears when political commentary is needed, especially when the topic of the First Ladies arises. Now, Catherine will, of course, say more about this in her remarks, but let me preempt her a tad by saying that, to my mind, we historians of the presidency should do more to study the women who to date have shared a life, a home, a family, and yes, even a bedroom with our commanders-in-chief. Their influence is, I think, quite understated to date and quite understudied. And they are frequently their husband's most intimate advisor, by which I mean they are the voice that the president oftentimes hears not only loudest, but last before an important decision. And therefore, it seems to me that their history is worth studying indeed. Now, God willing, I hope that not only someday will we be able to study the history of first ladies, but also a first man as well. So, Catherine is a teacher, a historian, and a student of something that we should study more. Now, this you could all tell from her biography. Let me tell you something perhaps that you didn't know, and that is will become apparent once she begins her remarks. Simply put, she thinks like us. She's one of those historians who longs to speak beyond the academy, to speak to the public, and thus in some small way to engage contemporary as well as historic debates on issues far and wide. Now, she has since made proof of this by her new position, which I hope she'll take a few moments at some point, maybe during a Q&A perhaps, to talk about, as Director of Education for the Huntington Library, a program designed explicitly to bring history to the public. Now, we at the Center for Presidential History, and I think we at the Bush Library as well, know that there is simply no better guide to understanding our own times and where we might go than to study where we've been. Speaking frankly then, Catherine gets this, and frankly as well, she's among the very best at it. Thus, it is a great pleasure indeed to introduce to you tonight our first speaker of the year, Professor Catherine Allgor.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here always at SMU. And I want to thank the Center for Presidential History and Jeffrey Engels for bringing me, and for the George W. Bush Presidential Library. And thank you to Rana Spitz for making it all happen, getting me across the country. I have, as Jeffrey said, a very particular mission today. My charge is to make the case why the group of women we call First Ladies are worthy of historical study. And I intend to use my First Lady, Dolley Madison, wife of our fourth president, James Madison, who served from 1809 to 1817. I'm going to use her as my data set. But of course, I hope what I use to persuade you can be applied to a variety of historical contexts and a variety of First Ladies. Now, you may be wondering why I have to make this case. Surely, studying such a group of sophisticated, accomplished, famous women is what my students would call a no-brainer. But the truth is, though there's a lot written about First Ladies, not a lot of it is scholarly. And by scholarly, I mean researched with primary sources and written in accordance with the highest historical scholarship. So, before I make my case, and because I've always wanted to go to law school, I'm going to argue the other side, to maybe try to explain why scholars don't study the First Ladies. Now, surely one of the reasons for the lack of scholarly curiosity about First Ladies has to do with their status as a subset of women's history. Put simply, women as subjects of history, with their lives and words being taken seriously, is a recent phenomenon. In fact, that subfield we call women's history has really been in the academy only about 45 years or so. So just by being women, and thus far they all have been women, First Ladies don't get studied because women don't get studied. But more specifically, scholars might argue that the category of First Lady is a false one, because of the random nature of the affiliation. What are the odds that a woman is going to grow up to marry a president of the United States? I think you would have a better chance of getting hit with lightning, twice. At first glance, you might think that this group of women who eventually attained the station is no more related than strangers who happen to board a bus, even if it goes on to be a famous bus like that one in Speed with Sandra Bullock. They're just random people, and you wouldn't really study them as a group. Now, I should say, I do concede random. They are a random group. These women came to the unelected office via many paths. Of course, you could say the same thing about presidents. The men who grew up to be president were born into poor families, middle-class households, and affluent clans in the North and the South, East and the West. Some came from political dynasties. Some were the first in their families to go to college. In the pool of would-be future presidents, we've had lawyers, soldiers, tailors, farmers, teachers, ministers, sheriffs, newspaper publishers, journalists, etc. Well, now you could say to me there's a difference here, and there is. There is something that all these men have in common. At some point, they decided to be president, and they worked for it. And that's enough to make them an analytic category worth studying as a group. So some might say that's not the same with First Ladies. They just each happened to marry a man who'd go on to make a decision, usually well into their marriage, to be the leader of the country. You could say, well, it was never their decision, and they agreed at this decision. They've run the gamut from dread to eager ambition. But no matter how they regarded potential First Ladyhood, these women were in the race because their husbands were. And that you can say, and that is true. The one exception might be Florence and Warren Harding. I have a feeling Florence wanted to be president, and she drafted Warren to get it for her. So it is their randomness as a group that defies tidy analysis. There is, I have to mention as a tangent, one more really random group, I think. There's a wonderful book by Bonnie Angelou called First Mothers, The Women Who Shaped the Presidents. And I think if the odds are long about marrying a president, what are the odds of, giving birth to one? But now I've made the case, I think, for why the Academy doesn't, for the most part, study First Ladies seriously. So let me ask the more positive question: why do we study First Ladies? And the first answer to that question is, why not? If we study First Ladies simply as potential historical subjects, they are as worthy of study as any individual. The women who occupy the post are often dynamic, interesting, compelling women. It's no accident that they're the spouses of men charismatic or intelligent enough to get elected to the highest office in the land. And so I want to take for a moment this idea of them as just a historical subject. I would say to you that whether she was a First Lady or not, we would be studying the papers of Louisa Catherine Johnson Adams, who is the wife of John Quincy Adams. Before Eleanor Roosevelt, and I would say even after for a good bit, she was our most literate First Lady, but she has the diaries, poems, letters, and even autobiographical fragments that we value in a person of the past. Speaking of sources, one of the reasons that some people get to be historical subjects and some people don't are sources, the papers about or by a person. Often because of their position, First Ladies have lots of sources. 20th century First Ladies such as Eleanor Roosevelt, Lady Bird Johnson, Rosalind Carter, Betty Ford, Barbara Bush have letters to and from them. They have diaries. Some even have publications. For Hillary Clinton, Laura Bush, Michelle Obama, we're also going to have things like email and electronic calendars. But even much earlier First Ladies have lots of papers. Dolley Madison's correspondence encompasses thousands of letters. And also, as crucial are the papers about a First Lady because it is a First Lady, all those things written about her in private letters and in the press. So, and these are the things obviously that ordinary people don't get. Just because of sources, we might want to study the women who became First Ladies as historical subjects. And some of them are excellent historical subjects. So what makes an excellent historical subject? Well, it's someone who not only tells you what it's like to be a human being in a particular historical context, but they tell you something about that historical context and something profound. So let me get out my data set. Let me get out Dolley Madison. And let's just look at her as a historical subject. And there's a lot about her life that gives historical food for thought, but I'm going to take one topic, Dolley Madison and slavery. Now, on one hand, her experience, because she's an elite woman, is very exceptional around slavery, but on the other, it does say something about the institution. In 1768, Dolley Madison was born in a world of slave-holding white men. Though her actual birth took place on the North Carolina frontier, she grew up as a member of the Virginia gentry, surrounded by her mother's people, the Coleses of Hanover County. But the Coleses were not your ordinary first family of Virginia. They were Quakers. Dolley's mother, Mary Coles, married John Payne, and he converted to Quakerism. Dolley's largely Anglican neighbors might have been able to live the life of slaveholders seemingly without questioning the issue of chattel slavery. But early in Dolley's young life, the Society of Friends questioned whether slavery was compatible with their ideals that all human beings were equal. John Payne's family, including little Dolley, must have been privy to discussions about slavery and its consequences, and a kind of questioning not shared by other Virginia families. Now, the Society of Friends eventually arrived at the conclusion that slaveholding was incompatible with their ideals, and when Dolley was about 15, so a young girl, her father freed his few slaves. Because he could not farm without them, he transplanted his family to a city, not even a southern city, but chilly Philadelphia, the center of Quakerism. And for about 10 years after he moves, life is disastrous for the Paynes. All three of Dolley's older brothers die, as does a baby sister named Philadelphia. Father, John Payne, failed in business and due to shady business dealings was read out of Quaker meeting. In order to make ends meet, Dolley's genteel mother was forced to open a boarding house, and her father was so ashamed of this that he fell into a deep depression and he died. But not before betrothing Dolley to a man to marry that she probably didn't choose, a man named John Todd. In 1793, Dolley, along with thousands, experienced the trauma of a widespread disease epidemic of yellow fever, and in that epidemic, she loses her husband, John Todd, her in-laws, and one of her sons, her new baby. So in 10 years, all this happens to her, so between the ages of about 15 to 25. So at this point, right after her first husband's death in 1794, that Dolley would meet her second husband, James Madison. Dolley had her choice of prominent men to marry, but she took the first offer of which we know, and this presents us with a bit of a puzzle. Though with hindsight it is clear that the Madison marriage would be a success on all levels, it's not clear why this gorgeous, well-provisioned young widow would marry James. Now, make no mistake, James is the intellectual giant of the Revolution and the father of the Constitution, but he was 17 years older than she was, and not what we would call sexually charismatic. If there were more students here, I would say he is not hot, right? So why does she do this? And one of the clues may lie in his Southern roots. What James provided for Dolley, besides the romance and security that many a beau could offer, was a return to the world of the Virginia gentry. To a young woman who knew only trauma in her time in Philadelphia, whose golden memories of her childhood contrasted sharply with her experience in the North, surely the idea of a Virginia homecoming held its appeal. She would be returning to the South and as the mistress of a plantation. How much James' southernness counted for Dolley is only historical speculation, as is the second issue that this marriage between these two people brings up. If marriage to James meant a return to plantation life, it also meant a return to the world of chattel slavery. And it seems beyond historical imagination that this did not cross her mind. And this is where the sources fail us. We don't have any record of her thought process. Perhaps, though, Dolley associated abolitionist ideas with her family's misfortunes, which had begun when her father freed his slaves. And perhaps she was just so happy to relax back into the familial world of slavery. We can, however, so we don't have sources of the time, but we can look at her later letters, and we discover that whatever qualms she might have had as a young person about slavery, by middle age, Dolley spoke about slavery, or at least slaves, as though she had been raised to accept slavery without question. Like other Southerners, she viewed the institution less as a system of labor and more as a personal power struggle. For a woman famed for her empathy and insight, it is shocking to hear her discuss people in terms of cash, as she inquired of her sister, "I would buy a maid, but good ones are rare and as high as $800 or $900. I should like to know what you gave for yours." Nor could she understand, as she complained about her light-fingered maid, Suki, why a person whose labor is in effect stolen every day might steal from her mistress. Now, during our Q&A, we can talk more about this issue if you like. It's interesting to see what happens with Dolley and slavery after her death, and she becomes a focus, actually, for the new abolitionist movement in her later years in the 1830s and 40s. But I think I've made my point that one reason to study women who have found themselves as first ladies is that they're often historical subjects in their own right. Now, talking of Dolley's decision to marry James Madison makes me think of the reason my colleague, Cokie Roberts, likes to make when she's arguing why we should look at founding mothers and Liberty's daughters. And I hope Cokie will appreciate that I've worked both titles of her books in there, right there. She says that we should be interested because these women tell us about the founding men. Specifically, they make their menfolk seem more human. She has a favorite story to illustrate her point, but I'm not going to tell it here. It involves Chief John Marshall and a pair of pants, and I'm not going to tell it in case you get a chance to hear Cokie tell it. It's also a bit risque for this distinguished group. And I have a little risque of my own as I play out Coky's point that we study these women to make their menfolk more human. Madison family lore holds that it was love at first sight for James as he spied the tall, striking, curvaceous widow Todd on the streets of Philadelphia. By definition, love at first sight does not presuppose one knows anything about the object of one's crush. In fact, one must concede that a large part of love at first sight is lust. And I know that doesn't usually come up in discussions of James Madison. James may not have known about Dolley when he spotted her across a crowded Philadelphia street, but he became irretrievably smitten, and he knew what he liked, and he pursued her ardently. He even enlisted Dolley's relative, her cousin Catherine Coles, to write to Dolley on his behalf while he was visiting Catherine. So Catherine gleefully reported, "He told me I might say what I pleased to you about him." Catherine went on to relay the information that, quote, "He thinks so much of you in the day that he has lost his tongue, and at night he dreams of you and starts in his sleep a calling on you to relieve his flame, for he burns." And she added, "He has consented to everything I have wrote about him with sparkling eyes." As I said before, the Madisons went on to have a really loving, happy marriage. In fact, we don't have many letters between them, which is really the ultimate test. They didn't like to be separated. But when we do read the few letters we have, we find people not only in love, but happy to express it. If, as Coky says, we study these women to reveal the human side of the founders, then James's letters, ending with unalterable love, I remain yours, and Dolley's, our hearts understand each other, surely do that. Studying First Ladies can also tell us about topics beyond their own individual experiences. For example, their experiences can inform us about the role or the state of women in their historical context or gender roles. And I have to say, this is the one question I get asked most frequently about from reporters. They'll say, what does Michelle Obama or Laura Bush or Hillary Clinton tell us about women in America? And even as they're asking this question, even the reporters don't seem to believe that this is true. How can this one woman, and an exceptional woman, she's First Lady, tell us anything about the mass of women? Even First Ladies themselves can hardly believe what gets projected on them. I think Hillary Rodham Clinton was kind of amazed at the strong feelings and strong rhetoric she engendered just by living a life that she'd been living as an adult before with no problems. I think Nancy Reagan could have told her a little bit about that as well. Michelle Obama consequently seems less surprised and more bemused as TV pundits rail on about her arms and her body. But Mrs. Clinton's surprise was on the right track. First Ladies have a projective quality, and that goes both ways. So the first way it goes is the electorate and the public project their own feelings about male candidates, good and bad, on to First Ladies. They also project their own anxieties about women in society and women in power on First Ladies or potential First Ladies. And that's not always a good thing, as First Ladies often act as a lightning rod, a deflector for their mates. It's small comfort to tell them that such projections are nothing personal, it's just politics. But it's also true the other way. That is, a canny woman can do a little deliberate projecting of her own. So let's return to our data set, to Dolley Madison. Looking at Dolley and her career, political career, tells us about gender roles. And even as I'm going to tell you about gender roles, it's also going to reveal, I hope, an important insight into our government and our nation. Dolley Madison gets the appellation, the nickname, First Lady, because she innovated many parts of the role that we now take for granted, including the role of what I call the charismatic figure. And a charismatic figure is somebody who's kind of larger than life, who can project messages that are psychological and emotional in nature. Earlier I spoke of the ample sources, not only by Dolley, but around her, all those letters and papers. Everyone who went to Washington wanted to meet Dolley, and they attended her famous weekly drawing rooms. And they were held every Wednesday during the congressional season, and they were so crowded, hundreds of people crammed into the White House, that they were called squeezes. Everyone described them, and the woman they called Queen Dolley, in letters to the folks back home. And it's important to regard these descriptions as something beyond merely colorful celebrity mentions. They were a form of political analysis. Right from the start, Dolley personified the Madison administration. The lack of bureaucracy in early America, the early United States, and the lack of established structure in the federal government meant that the new Americans focused on personalities for affirmation and reassurance. And we see that right after the Revolution, they do this with George Washington, and in the early Republic, they do it to Dolley. The people who regarded Dolley so minutely, whether they're members of the ruling elite, or ordinary Americans or Europeans interested in the Republican experiment, they were looking for signs and significance in how she looked and how she behaved. And I'll even add to you that this personifying capacity, though she could have known it, would intensify during the War of 1812, when Dolley begins to become a stand-in, not just for the Madison administration, but for the nation. So all these descriptions of what she wore and how she treated people and how she held herself, what's that about? Well, the focus on the body of the ruler had long roots in Western court culture. In English and European courts, the ruler's body and its capacities, especially when it came to fighting and birth, were regarded as an extension or a part, really, of public policy. And as I said, George Washington was very much a participant, well, he was an unwitting participant in this. But you may be asking, didn't we actually fight a war against a king and a monarchy and royal stuff? And the truth is we did. In fact, the American Revolution was fought not only against a king with the absolute power attendant on such a being, but everything that monarchy stood for. The political theory of republicanism, what we call small r republicanism, especially as articulated by men such as John Adams, proudly trumpeted the virtue of manly American simplicity over the aristocratic corruption of the old world. But just as the fires of revolution were dying down, something odd happens. The ruling men of this new United States of America began to worry. They got rid of the absolute power. How could they assert their authority over the mass of largely uneducated white men? They didn't worry about their authority over white women or people of color, assuming that white men had the authority over their households in place. White male citizens, the foundation of the Republic, were also its greatest threat. In an ironic twist, the founding men discovered, even as they were putting the new nation together, that they might actually need the trappings of authoritarian aristocracy in order to command the people's respect. These monarchical trappings of the old world that's kind of easy to make, during the war, oh, we don't want any of that. They were the only vocabulary of power these former colonists knew. And as time passed, they began to co-opt some of these symbols of aristocracy in order to reassure the people that the right kind of people were ruling them. So we have these odd moments. In a breathtaking turnabout after the Revolution, the formerly rabid anti-monarchical John Adams suddenly started arguing for bestowing titles on lawmakers, following the practice of the British House of Lords. He even wanted to call the president His Majesty or His High Mightiness. We have another moment where newly elected President Washington found himself wondering, how many pairs of matched horses should he have to drive his carriage through the streets of the Capitol? Enough that would convey a proper sense of authority without being unrepublican. So how would the new ruling classes use the old vocabulary of aristocracy to convey the legitimacy of the national experiment? And perhaps Federalists like George Washington and John Adams would have just taken the whole thing wholesale, but Americans were still wary of anything, what they call creeping monarchy, especially the followers who would become the Republican Party, the followers of Thomas Jefferson. And as it turns out, once you know this, you can see the different ways this balance of aristocracy / democracy play out. In the case of Adams's proposal, titles for legislatures were rejected, and as we know, the executive became Mr. President. And by the way, the proper amount of pairs of horses is 3 horses to take your carriage through, total of 6 horses in all, and so President Washington didn't make a bad mistake. But once you are alerted to this, you understand too that one of the ways this tension plays out, as issues of power often do, was on a field of gender. So for the most part, elite women of the ruling classes and of political families were given the task of conveying aristocratic messages to the masses. Because they were private and not elected, ironically, women had more latitude. So George does become Mr. President, but Martha Washington becomes Lady Washington, and the new Americans could project their own longings for an aristocratic ruler onto her. So when Dolley set out to create this persona, this charismatic figure, she's not the first woman charged to embody the elite, but as Dolley tended to do, she did it bigger and better than anyone else. Dolley used her own self writ large to create an American queen, around whom people could rally, a figure who radiated calm goodness. Her queen dressed royally, at least as royally most Americans could imagine how royalty would dress, arrayed in pink satin and ermine, with waving peacock feathers attached to her trademark turbans. Dolley ensured that she literally and figuratively dominated any room. Her gorgeous dress, lavish entertainments, and sense of ease transmitted messages of legitimacy, stability, and authority to new Americans and Europeans alike. Americans who fought the Revolution and their children called her Queen Dolley as a way to honor her public service. So, this moment I've given you, this glimpse into Dolley Madison, what does this tell us about gender roles or about the government? For political historians, it's interesting to see, for the most part, people loved Dolley's queen. They praised her regal performance as a national asset, essential for the solidity and legitimacy of the Republican experiment. And when people criticize Dolley, strangely enough, they don't do it because she's too royal, but because she's too powerful. What's going on? Well, the standard view is that after the successful rebellion against a king, the founders set out to create a world made new. That was one of their favorite phrases. A brand new shiny experiment in Republican democracy, unlike any seen in human history. That's what we learned in school, and that's what the founders themselves tell us. But when it came time to put those theories into practice, it became clear that the theory was not enough to run a country, let alone provide the stability and unity a brand new experiment it needed. While the official men struggled with Republican theories of virtue, their women took over the practical business of politics. To make the noiseless machine of government run, women adapted and adopted court practices. For instance, the kind of lavish material display that bestowed status in the old country and colonial America. That's what's behind all that pink satin and all that ermine. English gentry had long used houses and social events to cement their standings, as Dolley used the White House and her squeezes. American political women even brought the most heinous of court practices into the federal government, that of patronage. One important thing we learned by looking at Dolley and other women is that in early Washington, women, not men, performed the crucial role of patronage, meaning giving jobs to cement, garner, and reward political support. During the Madison administration, Dolley Madison stood at the center of the Capitol's patronage network. As one House guest remarked, "A number of persons make their wishes known in the first instance to Mrs. Madison. I am very frequently amused with seeing letters to her on those subjects, sometimes even written by ladies for their husbands, brother, or cousins." As patronage studies in other contexts show, the political effects of patronage extends beyond the simple act of bestowing favors. Patronage also fosters a climate of political unity and national cohesion, a crucial function in a brand new nation that has 13 colonies spread over a wide geographic area. James Madison's goal was always for unity. Dolley took advantage of patronage's connection-making capacities in order to create bipartisan cooperation and relationships not possible in the heated politics of the official sphere. So if you listen to the official men, the walls between parties were rigid. But if you look at Dolley's letters, you see something different. So it won't surprise you if I tell you she had a very fruitful patronage relationship with the Jeffersons. After all, the Jeffersons were Madison friends and neighbors. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison founded the Republican Party together. But Dolley also kept political channels open with the Federalist Adams women by providing jobs to their male kin. So that's one thing we're seeing here. We're seeing that the official story that we were given by our teachers and our founders might not be the whole story. And what does it tell about gender roles? Well, I hope you're noticing that and we're talking about the early 1800s, how much women are participating in this early nation-making effort, and that it's going to change in the future. So when we think of certain kinds of groups of people getting their rights, say African-American men or women of all races and classes, we think of things as progressive, that they get better, that they rise up, they fight for their rights, and things get better. And we look at our own sort of 20th century history. In 1920, finally women get the vote, and in the 1970s there's a women's movement, and women fight for admission to colleges and equal pay and all of that, and we sort of see it as progressive. But looking at how openly Dolley and her colleagues operate in a political sphere alerts us to the back and forth of change. That is, what does it mean that they're acting more openly political than women 100 years later, so say early 20th century, could? And that alerts us to the sort of back and forthness of change. As a matter of fact, Dolley and her colleagues are operating in the wake of the American Revolution, which politicized white women of the middling and ruling classes. What isn't usually known in history books is that in the 1810s, 1820s, 1830s, there's a backlash, and women's political progress is set back several decades. And that, again, is something that we learn by looking at what she's doing. So I hope I've strengthened my point by revealing that the new nation is more dependent on aristocratic forms than we hitherto thought. We get this from studying Dolley. And this is not something we would know about our own history if we studied, let's just say, James. So let me take my analysis a little bit further and say because first ladies are an access point to the political process, they can also tell us about political theory that's applicable to many contexts. So by revealing the role of aristocracy in the early government, that's particular to her context. But let's try this one on for size. Let's go back to those drawing rooms, those crowded Wednesday night squeezes. Though initially an introduction was required for an invitation, Dolley's soirees soon became open to all, friends and enemies alike. Official families, local gentry, visitors from across the country and the globe, members of the diplomatic corps, they all came to the squeezes and were just as likely to come face to face with their local tailor or boarding house keeper. No wonder Pennsylvania Representative Jonathan Roberts declared that by allowing all, quote, "Mrs. Madison, I understand, has equivocally declared she is a Democrat," meaning just welcoming to others. Dolley's drawing rooms were literally a bipartisan location. Lured by the food, the music, and the dazzling setting, people came. And they were more like modern cocktail parties than formal receptions. People moved freely, making connections, forming and then reforming groups, mingling, chatting. Much politicking was done in the drawing room, including soliciting support for legislation, floating proposals, seeking patronage, and gathering and dispensing information. And the regularity of the drawing room happened every Wednesday night, even in the face of the illness and then death of Vice President Elbridge Gerry, gave everyone a place they could count on to see and be seen. And for the most part, people reacted positively to the drawing rooms, but it's interesting that those who didn't like them still went. They were indispensable to Washington business. The key component of the drawing room was access. So the first person you could have access in if you found yourself at a Madison drawing room was James Madison. He stood quietly greeting his guests while his wife sort of worked the room. And never before or since has the access to the president been so free. Anybody could shake his hand. But I think even more importantly, people had access to each other. Attendance at a drawing room offered men who worked together the opportunity to further and deepen their relationships and brought together men from all the branches of government as well. The architecture of Washington, reflecting this fear of centralized power, kept the branches of government apart. But on Wednesday night, the White House architecture brought people together. With music, food, and the presence of family signaling the unofficial atmosphere, official men could transcend the partisan political stances they felt obligated to take on the floors of Congress and in the press. And let me pause for a second and tell you why Dolley's feat of bringing congressmen together in the same room and making them behave was so crucial. I know we think of our political milieu as partisan, but we have nothing on the era of the early republic. Slander and libel ran unchecked, and there was real violence. This is the era where men shot each other in duels and hit each other with canes around politics, and not just on the streets, but on the floors of Congress. So why was the early national period so violent? Partly this was due to the high level of fear and anxiety. No one was sure that the Republican experiment was going to work. This was the era when the United States of America was plural. People would say the United States of America are, right? But the real problem was that the U.S. was not set up to be ruled by a two-party system. The people of Dolley's era believed that only one point of view should prevail, that only one group should rule, and that any dissension from that one group was treason. But two different factions believed this. So the Republicans, with a capital R, the Republican Party, and the Federalists were fighting to the death, even as they were building a two-party system, the very kind of system which fosters democracy. And that's why Dolley's goal of bringing everyone into the room, making them behave and interact as human beings with families, was not just nice, it was crucial. In a political culture that framed issues in black and white, where there was no way to understand the function of an informed dissent, at Dolley's drawing room, people could interact with everyone at their most human. If political rhetorics on both sides painted the opposition as the embodiment of evil, the reality of the drawing rooms made such characterizations hard to sustain. Women in political families forged social relationships across the aisle that mitigated the acid partisanship. For the men, seeing a male political enemy with his family, getting to know his female kin outside the overheated atmosphere of politics, played its part in showing that those who disagree could all agree on the public good. Slowly, under Dolley's eye, this motley group of former colonists were constructing a ruling class and the tools for what official men did not even have a name for, bipartisanship. When, in a decade or so, it would become clear that there was to be a two-party system, the structure laid out first in Dolley's drawing rooms and then in the social spheres of her imitators could rise to meet the challenge. And I should say, it's not just that Dolley brought people together, generously offering the many kinds of access her entertainments had and just letting them go to it. She also actively worked to enforce a code of civility that allowed people to see the best in each other. All of her life, Dolley was famed for her avoidance of contention. Her niece, Mary Cutts, there's actually a book out there by Mary, wrote the first biography of her aunt, and she said, "To the powerful and arrogant, she would accord all their vanity exacted. She would say it was not her place to treat them otherwise." Dolley herself advised one of her protégées, Phoebe Morris, that, quote, "To have conciliated the regard of those by whom we are surrounded, it is a sensation, my dear girl, worth all the pains you can take." So Dolley is not merely sidestepping conflict, but actively reaching out to charm and disarm. Dolley was always willing to beard the lion in his den. She did not merely avoid dissension, she dissipated it. And she set the example herself, back to Jonathan Roberts, who says, "By her deportment in her own house, you cannot discover who is her husband's friend or foe. Her guests have no right to claim of her partiality." But she went beyond that, just that modeling of how people should be, using her personality as a tool of policy. As one savvy political observer commented, All parties appeared at Dolley's drawing room, knowing they should all share in her kind welcome and benignant smile. She felt it was her duty to pour oil onto the waters of discord and draw malcontents into the fold of her husband. And successful she was, for few would oppose the partner of such a wife. So, what does this mean for political theory? What we learned from Dolley's drawing rooms is that for politics to happen, two spheres of activity are needed. The official sphere is the product of politics, the declaration, the legislation, the press release. The unofficial sphere is what many people call behind the scenes, where the process of politicking, the lobbying, the persuading goes on. Unofficial spheres develop at social events, at homes. Social events often take place in private spaces. And because that is true, women play an important part in the unofficial sphere. Dolley's unofficial sphere supplied a federal government that was lamentably light on bureaucracy with a structure within which political tasks could be done. So as we close, I hope I made my case. There are many reasons to study First Ladies. Many of them are worthy of study in their own rights. That is, they can tell us about what it means to be human and shed light on their own particular historical context. They certainly make the founding father menfolks seem much more human and less statue-like. Taking the work of First Ladies seriously also uncovers parts of American history not available in a strictly presidential or male narrative. For instance, as we've seen tonight, the reliance on rural forms in the early national government, the role of the unofficial sphere in politics, and the presence of a revolutionary backlash against women in politics that echoes down to today. All of this is revealed when we see what the women are doing. I also hope tonight that I have encouraged any future biographers and scholars of First Ladies. And if I have another piece of advice. I encourage a deep study of a single woman or several women, ones that adhere to scholarly standards of argument and evidence. Much of the First Lady literature is collective portraits or those collections of every First Lady, and often they're dependent on each other, so they kind of recycle faulty information. I can't promise that all such undertakings will be as fruitful as my work with Dolley, but if a scholar is lucky, he or she will make the kinds of discoveries that Dolley helped me to see and more. So let me leave you today with maybe the most important point I found by studying Dolley. So I mentioned a bit ago that from the beginnings of the government, our national politics seem particularly violent, rather excessively masculine form of ruling. And if we know that, and we think that's all of our history, maybe we despair that anything will ever change. But if we look at Dolley Madison's ruling style, we see that there are other possibilities in our history. At one point, Speaker of the House Henry Clay teased Dolley, declaring, "Everybody loves Mrs. Madison," to which she replied, "Mrs. Madison loves everybody." And I love that statement. It shows that indeed everybody, or nearly everybody, fell under her spell. The mention of love signals the secret behind her appeal. Dolley brought love and empathy into political discourse, and in doing so, she modeled for us a political behavior that allows the participants to see each other as full human beings. Her model of bipartisan process, one that emphasizes cooperation over coercion, that builds bridges instead of bunkers, with an emphasis on civility and empathy, proved necessary for building a modern, democratic nation-state. The men of her day could not envision bipartisanship. They didn't even have a word for it. For them, politics was an all-or-nothing, zero-sum activity where men regularly fought and murdered each other over ideologies. That Dolley could envision a politics of cooperation and power-sharing marks her as the most modern politician of her time. And that model is her lasting gift to the nation. Thank you. Oh, of course, my favorite part.
Thank you, Catherine. That was just as fascinating as we expected. So we do have some time for some questions. And if you do have a question, we have microphones on either side. And I'm going to ask that you all raise your hand if you have a question, just like class. And if you have that question, we will bring the microphone to you, which we need in order to make sure that you're recorded for posterity and therefore on the website, and therefore as a sign of bipartisanship in the future. So.
This is like having my own talk show, the microphones and the...
Tell us about your feelings.
Yeah, oh, no, let's not.
Questions?
Yes.
Sir.
So we're going to get you... You're going to be a star now, sir. Make the most of your time in the spotlight.
You mentioned one of my favorite bad presidents, and that's Warren G. Harding. And I wonder if you've studied, since the relationships of first ladies to their president husbands is based on the marriage. And I wondered if you studied the any affairs that the various presidents have had while in office, and how the first ladies have dealt with them, and who would you...
Look at this guy. We get to the dirt right away. You can't even give me some softballs. Okay.
Yeah. So who were the randy guys in office?
Well, I know you don't even warm me up with anything. Well, it's interesting, and I'm going to say, even though I just had made a really terrible crack about the Hardings, my first lady studies are pretty much in the 19th century. But I will say something that's sort of interesting. So I know about Abigail Adams up to sort of Jackson, this sort of thing. And what's interesting is that there isn't a lot of what you would imagine as sort of extramarital stuff going on. And I say this because the people who used to ask me about that were people who studied the European courts. So if you look at European courts and European aristocracy, the mistress, Madame Pompadour is the famous example, plays a large part in policy making, if you want to call it that, certainly political practice, patronage, and that's kind of missing in early Washington, D.C. And I think that part of so we don't have, for instance, Henry Clay having a powerful mistress, or John Calhoun keeping, we don't have that. And I think that part of it is the presence of free black African-American free populations and also slaves. They mitigate that. In other words, the extramarital sexual affairs may happen within that group of people. And also, it seems that, I won't say presidents, but government officials would tend to go down in class for their liaisons. One of the figures in early Washington that was sort of seen as loose is the boarding housekeeper's daughter. We have a few scandals around them, a few marriages. And I wish I could remember the exact quote. Actually, Cokie would. Louisa Catherine Johnson Adams was served on the Washington Orphan Asylum Board. And after Congress was probably overdue, didn't adjourn until June, they left behind a lot of things to go into the orphan asylum. They left behind progeny. And so she says something about maybe that we should have a tax on congressmen to take care of their various, yes. So. There we go. Sorry, I was calling on you. I shouldn't do that. It's just professor
right.
Sure. Yeah.
Early in what you were talking about, it reminded me of, I used to teach U.S. history to fifth graders, and there was a wonderful documentary about the Revolutionary War, and I was remembering how I always thought in our early history we wanted to be nothing like Britain, and the truth was, according to this documentary, that we very much wanted to be like Britain. We were kind of the stepchild, that the early founding fathers really wanted to be like the aristocracy of Britain. So I wondered if you could expand on that. And then I had a second question, which I was wondering about the sacrifice that First Ladies made, and I think particularly of Abigail Adams. It struck me when I read John Adams, written by David McCullough, that they spent 10 years apart. She ran the farm while he was over in Europe, France, England, being an ambassador and going to Philadelphia and doing all of the things in the government. So I know that Dolley later in her life was destitute. So that was certainly a sacrifice, but not necessarily because of the presidency.
Right.
So I was wondering if you could share something about that.
Well, certainly, I'll say it's interesting when you, and I think that this is an area of, I'm seeing glimmerings in my own profession, that the study of aristocracy, which used to be sort of the dirty little secret of American history, is now getting studied. Certainly before the American Revolution, part of the pride of being an English colonist in the colonies was that you were an Englishman. And certainly, people like Thomas Jefferson, other members of the landed gentry, George Washington, saw themselves as equivalent to the gentry. And one of the blows to their pride was when push came to shove and England decided to turn to the colonies as a form of money, that they were not seen that way. And in fact, their debts were honored differently. And so there's this pre-revolutionary pride in being an Englishman, albeit one far away from London. And then there's this sort of stinging realization that you're not an Englishman, and that fuels the revolution and the kind of feeling of, oh, we're going to get rid of all of that. But the attachment to that tradition and the very practical use of the trappings of monarchy as a vocabulary of power stays with them. And it will stay with them as well. If I can recommend a great book, it's called The Refinement of America by Richard Bushman, and it talks about this attachment that Americans have in aristocracy, again, hidden, and it lasts way into the 20th century. And as far as the sacrifices, well, that's something I think that is very apparent. I was actually thinking of our present First Lady, Michelle Obama, thinking of 8 years, add a couple campaign years, so 10 years. I was thinking about her children. 10 years or 9 years is a lot in the life of a child, and as you know, in a parent watching a child going from 9 to 18 years old, and I was thinking how much of that is unfolding in a very particular kind of environment. So certainly, I would say we shouldn't study people just because we honor them, but if that was the only reason to study someone, we should definitely study First Ladies.
Good evening. You mentioned that Dolley was brought up among slaveholders.
Yes.
Which is interesting. I didn't know that. You also mentioned that she was, in her later childhood or young adulthood, raised by Quakers. And I believe they are very radical abolitionists in general. So I'm wondering, while she was First Lady, did she attempt to move the national debate in one direction or the other on the issue of slavery?
Yeah, just to clarify, her parents were Quakers, so she was born into a Quaker family, and her father was a convert. You know all those jokes about converts. I have a feeling her mother was kind of like a lackadaisical Quaker, but the father took it really seriously. But they were also slaveholders at the time. They didn't have very many slaves, about 9, and actually Dolley grew very close to some of them. But then at some point, the Quakers, they decide. So she's raised as a slave, or her father's a slaveholder and a Quaker. No, and talking about the abolitionist movement, Dolley does not do that. It would have been kind of out of context in a way, but Dolley Madison is not a radical in any way, and that's what's so interesting. Some people will say, oh, Dolley Madison, she was such a feminist. Well, she wasn't. She was a very conservative, Southern white mother and wife, and she would tell you that she had no desire to influence politics in any way whatsoever, even as she was giving jobs out. So it's such an irony that somebody who's essentially a very conservative person who would not have dreamed of speaking about abolition, though her cousin Edward Coles will, actually has this great deal of power to change things, even as she's, as I said, not a radical in any way at all. So she doesn't. But let me tell you, so what happens, James Madison dies in 1836, and there's a great expectation, including with cousin Edward Coles, that he's going to free his slaves. George Washington did it. George Washington set the example. Everybody understood why Thomas Jefferson couldn't do it, but they kind of expected that James would. And there was a great deal of shock and consternation. This is 1836, so we have the abolition movement is now a real movement in America, that he doesn't do it. And the reason he doesn't is because he's pretty impoverished, and these slaves are the only thing standing between Dolley and destitution. He does say that slaves were not to be sold, But it's not a few days after his death when the slave buyers are there buying slaves. And so Dolley is, in part deserves some of this, in part doesn't. She becomes a lightning rod once again. All the disappointment people had about James Madison not freeing his slave get kind of deflected onto her. So she doesn't die until 1849. At some point between 1836 and 1840, she goes to Washington. She becomes this iconic figure. She's there at the Washington Monument. She's sending the first private telegraph. She's on a coin. She becomes an iconic figure. But part of that, too, is she becomes this focus of hatred of the abolitionists. And they even accuse her of hiding a secret will from James Madison to free the slaves, which isn't true. And so it's an interesting part of her history that, again, doesn't kind of get replicated. And yeah, so it's interesting. But she doesn't herself do anything except be the wife of a slaveholder. Nobody wants to take their turn in the spotlight. It's sad.
Well, I have a question.
Yes.
You made such an eloquent point that Dolley Madison recreated, and consciously it seems, recreated the role of the First Lady. What evidence do we have of her actually sitting down and writing letters or diaries or something saying, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to recreate the role of the First Lady.
Right. Now, that's a historian's question. That's, yes. So when I started the biography of Dolley, so I wrote about her in my first book, Parlor Politics. And then I discovered, to my dismay, that there had not been a modern scholarly biography of Dolley. Okay, that seems kind of, oh, there isn't even a non-modern biography of Dolley, really. Lots written about her, children's books, plays, but not really. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. I wonder why that is. And one of the reasons I found out is because after reading her letters, so you have Dolley, the famous Dolley, the Queen Dolley with the dresses and the political power and all that, and she doesn't talk about it at all. If you read her letters, they're interesting, they're fascinating, they're wonderful, but they don't go, I'm going to create me a political persona, or I'm going to buy this dress because I know it'll knock their socks off, or I gave away jobs tonight. And I realized, oh, shoot, I thought, that wasn't what I thought, but oh, shoot, this is why nobody, because the stuff you want to know about Dolley, she didn't talk about. But that's when I discovered all of the stuff about her. And other people looking at her and either praising her for being a political force, or even better, are the words of enemies. Words of enemies are the best proof ever. It's like, no, she's horrible, she's too powerful. So I thought I have to now take, because ideally you want the diary that says, this is what I'm doing, whatever. But it's this looking at this massive material around her and understanding that I was to use that seriously as a form of political analysis. So it's the discussion around Dolley. And then I didn't discover, but I read these two huge, they're fragments, we call them fragments, but they were big, by Dolley's niece, Mary Cutts. And she calls it a memoir of her aunt. But when you read them, and they didn't exist except in manuscript form, you understand that most of the action takes place before Mary's birth. So then you think, oh, this is the closest we have to an autobiography of Dolley. And in fact, there's the little green book out there is those two transcripts, transcribed, annotated, edited, and I have essays about them. And then you see Mary Cutts shaping a vision of Dolley. A Dolley who is not political, but gets everybody jobs. A Dolley who's a humble lady and a perfect lady, but a historically significant creature. And then I saw, so once you begin to read kind of under these layers of denial, and you can find these moments where the purposes clash, that's when you start to really understand these things. So it's really in reading the Mary Cutts biographies and in the massive letters about Dolley that, you know, you can finally write a biography of her. Yeah. Thank you so much for being such a good audience. It's a thank you.